what I want to do is with Beryl explore a thing or two, and that will help me establish an idea or two, which is going to be useful for radiating love. Okay, so it's a method to all of my stuff. Okay. So I asked you the question. I said, remember a time when you were just so madly in love, when you picked out when you first met your husband, I think.
Yeah.
Okay. And I'm going to ask you the question I asked you then. I'm going to say, well, what attracted to you? What made you fall in love? What attracted you and got you into that state?
Okay. And when I was with him, I felt like $1 million. I felt like I was on cloud 9.
Okay. Now, what I said to her and what I say to you is listen to the words that she used. It's, I felt like I was on cloud 9, right? That basically states, I'm getting something out of this, and that's why I'm here, and that's why I feel so good. We can also put in there, well, he compliments me, and he makes me look good, or whatever, okay? I mean, there's other things that go in there, but it's basically a list of what's in it for you. Am I correct?
Yeah, I couldn't find those other things about him.
Yeah,
I really couldn't.
All right.
I mean, his eyes.
All right, so, but let's be very blunt about, well, okay.
I mean, he was kind of weird, you know?
But, okay, he was kind of weird, but
he was really weird.
But
yeah,
we put up with that because you feel so good around him. Because you get some, you're willing to put up with all that, okay?
Yeah.
Right?
I still am.
Yeah, okay. Because there's something in it for you.
Yes.
Okay, now, to be blunt about that, that is one of the ways that we practice love here. One of the ways we experience love is because there's something in it for us. Is it not a selfish, another loaded word, right? But is it not a selfish pursuit?
Yeah.
Yeah, it is. It is a very, and is your husband doing the same thing?
Oh, yeah.
He gets the same kind of charge out of her. So, it's a match made in heaven, soulmates, or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
Yay, walks through the portals, and love goes on forever.
Yeah.
Well, not necessarily, maybe for you, but not necessarily for everybody. Okay. So anyway, it's a self-centered thing, and that's what the Course is pointing that out to us, by the way. And it's not something to say, oh, shame on you, look at this bad thing you're doing and you're calling it love, and no. It's a very gentle letting you know, hey, isn't this what you're doing? You know? And if you're honest about it, you go, yeah, I guess I am, okay. And that all comes from the idea of separation. I am separate. As a result of separating from God, or believing that I separated from God, I am now, I believe, cut off from God's love. Now, we may attend church and we may have spiritual experiences or pursuits and one thing and another to pursue it in getting love, et cetera, et cetera. But the love that we experience here is nothing like the revelation that I had, for example. In fact, we used an example. Down there in the breakfast room, I said, if my spiritual experience love, my revelation, filled this whole room, and I had a ceiling, 12 times as high as this ceiling here, and great big room and all that stuff. The amount of love that I generate when I did this experiment we did yesterday, where I closed my eyes and people had their physical things, etc., was only about this much of it. Okay, if I could generate all of that love all at the same time, we'd had 100%, and I could have people here with wheelchairs and crutches and throw them away and hallelujah and I'm saved and Gary is Jesus and all that stuff. But I am able to access, because of my work and my follow through and carry through and all that I've done, enough of it to make a difference. Now, if I can only go from here to here, that's doubling. That is a big deal, okay? But it's nowhere near where we can be. So we want to look at the possibilities, and that's what this workshop is about. How grand can it be? And let's see how far we can get with our practices, and so on. So, how'd I do?
Okay, you did great.
Okay.
I feel totally calm up here. That's amazing.
Do you? Okay.
I do, thank you.
Look at all these selfish people.
Look at all those.
There's a number of television programs that are out, and they're designed for people to find love. One of them, there's a bachelor or a bachelorette, and they have, if it's a bachelorette, for example, they have 25 really handsome, studly males come in, and they're all in love with, or want to be in love with the one lady, and she's supposed to send these guys home and choose one and all that kind of stuff.
Okay.
The theme in all of that is they are looking for love. They are trying to find love. Okay, that's the idea. How many have seen programs like that? I'm curious. Okay, that's a number of you. But the idea is we're trying to find love. And so, where do we find love? Where do you find love? Where do you find it? Is it out there in somebody else? Is love really out there in your husband, for example? Mm-mm. Is it, where is love?
It's in your heart.
Go ahead, Martin.
I've twice in my life heard something from outside speak to me so clearly, it's if they're right behind me.
Yeah.
And I moved down to San Diego to go to massage school after ending a 15-year relationship. Uh-huh. And I was not in a very good space. And I remember walking around downtown San Diego, watching couples and kind of feeling sorry for myself. And this voice said, you will not find love out there. You will find it within yourself.
Yeah.
And it was just like someone was right there saying it.
Wow.
All right. Thank you. So the idea is we're trying to find love someplace else, okay? And yet, can you really find it out there? You know, remember, it's a very selfish pursuit, okay? What can you do for me? You know, and by the way, I'll do for you, but I don't want to do too much work. You know, I just want to be me and you feel good, you know, that's all. Right? I mean,
yeah,
when
exactly.
you boil it down, isn't that, you know, pretty much
Yeah.
what we're talking about? Okay.
Yeah.
I don't want to compromise and do a whole bunch of stuff to make you love me, you know.
No, that's right, exactly.
Why would I do that? You know, fine, next. That will conclude our thing here, okay, my dear?
marvelous.
You need to give this back to me.
Mm-hmm.
And thank you, can we have a hand for Beryl? Okay. Now, I am going to ask Claudia. Where's Claudia? I'm going to ask you to come on up. Could you, Claudia? Hand for Claudia. Radiating love is one of several techniques, EFT-oriented techniques, that I have available to teach you. This one is going to be the workhorse. This one is the one that is the most valuable, the most useful, the most all-encompassing of all of them that I've developed to this point. As time goes on, I will develop more, and as the EFT community that I've already talked to you about develops, there's going to be more and more and more of that. Okay, but I want to take this particular one, and I want to do it thoroughly, not only with you, but with everybody in the audience. That's why it's going to be experiential. Okay, I am hopefully going to have all of you experience this. That's why I'm going to stop from time to time. I'm going to come out in the audience. I'm going to see what people are doing and how you're doing it and have questions and so on, because I want to be as thorough as I can. So we're likely to be here for a little while, okay? And we're only going to get started in the next 20, 25 minutes till the break, okay? So here, the idea of it is really quite simple, okay? The details we need to get into some, but the idea of it is easy. What we do is we take a moment from our own past, our own history, where we felt very loved. Could be just an instant moment. It could be something with a pet, with a person. Sometimes I've had women, for example, will feel very loving when they are breastfeeding their child at some moment, okay? I've had one lady can just remember her cat kissing her. Oh, God. You could remember something with your horse, for example. Your horse. But it could be, it's that little moment of love that we want to access, because everybody has some little moment of love. And by the way, if you don't have that little moment of love, that is a tappable issue, because when you go tap, 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 and these things can start showing up. Okay, oh, I remember, yes, I remember that now. But then once we start bringing into our system and generating this love, what we want to do is start expanding it. Remember, this love, although it's important to us, is a very small piece of the much grander love that we are in pursuit of here, okay? Very small piece. So we try to expand it. And we just do that mentally. We can start with it here and start to expand it. And what happens, and this is the very important piece of this, is as you start expanding this love within, you will find yourselves having blocks to it. You can only expand it so far, and here comes some self-talk, or here comes some kind of a block, and why can't I go any further? And sometimes you can identify it, and sometimes you can't, etc. That's a place where we stop and do EFT, to remove or put aside, at least for the moment, that block to the awareness of love's presence, okay? Are you with me? That's the idea of it, a simple, simple idea. And we can do that. I've had people do this, and it expands for them, and some quit doing it, as a matter of fact. Others keep doing it because it is so intoxicating in a way, okay? They feel so good doing it, and they can expand more and more and more. Those who don't do it, typically this is the ego saying to them, don't go too far here because, you're going to do something bad with me, the ego, You're going to start going places where I don't want you to go, So it's an interesting dynamic that goes on. And we'll explore all of that here. Okay. That's the idea of it. Now, I'm going to ask you, Claudia, and everyone else here, to pick out, close your eyes if you need to, but find a moment in your past where, that's love, okay? Just identify. All you have to do is identify it. Have you identified it? Mm-hmm. All right. Well, I'll give you 15 seconds. Go close your eyes and identify one, okay? Okay. Let me ask you first. What moment did you identify?
Well, let me check in with you and see if there's two emotions there. But as long as the love is there, it's still good?
Yeah, well, that's one reason we're stopping to ask these questions.
Okay.
So